All right. Well,
Very,
I am a kind of book history, literary historian as well as everything else. So perhaps sometime in the distant future, I might even offer up a talk about something in that range. There's a
okay.
new double volume come out, the history of the Scottish book, which has
Mhm.
just been published, two large volumes of which I'm co-editor. And but it covers the period pre 1707, of course, but it covers everything from Columbus to the Book of Kells, if you like, to
Oh yeah,
1707. Anyway,
but would love that,
yeah,
Alistair.
well, I don't know, but I'm, my brain is all over the place. I
Can I,
shall soon discover.
can I,
Um,
can I, just before I ask you to take over, Alistair, can I just say that what we're going to do is record this and make it available to those who clearly couldn't make us or couldn't connect this morning and any others. And if I could ask all of the attendees to mute their microphones and dim their cameras, we can hand over to you, Alistair, and take it away.
o- okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start speaking to you a bit before I get into my talk. Um, to explain a bit of biographical detail to help explain why I'm interested in parliaments. Uh, and some of us may think, how did we get from A to Z in our working lives? And very much in research, it's a bit like that too. I'm not switching on my PowerPoints yet in case you wonder what's going on. I will a bit later. Um, I worked for 12 years in London in publishing before I decided to bring my family back to Scotland and re-enter the education system. And it made sense then that when history became my major subject, that I did a PhD on the early book trade of Scotland, which I did. However, a new field of study came into view. As the general election of May 1997 loomed, John Major's unpopular Conservative UK government tried to placate demands in Scotland for a referendum on devolution in the form of a new Scottish Parliament. It refused this, but metaphorically dressed itself in a kilt and did what it could. It returned to Scotland the ancient stone of Scone on which kings of Scots were inaugurated, which had been kidnapped by Edward I of England in 1296. And its Secretary of State for Scotland dressed himself in tartan trousers. On the floor of the House of Commons, Major announced that the government would fund the project known as the Scottish Parliament Project. This cost £1.25 million or $1.2 million, and it ended up a 10-year project aimed to conclude in 2007 to coincide with the 300th anniversary of the Anglo-Scottish Parliamentary Union of 1707. Now, I'm going to try and share my slides with you now. Okay, you got that? I hope so.
We have indeed. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the project involved over 30 people, and I was fortunate to win a research fellowship, which allowed me to pay the bills, frankly. And I became one of the co-editors of what became the Records of the Parliaments of Scotland, or RPS, the homepage of which you see in front of you now. An essential online resource digitising the meetings of the old Scottish Parliament in the 500 years up to 1707. And when Tony Blair's Unionist Labour government won a landslide victory, it legislated for a referendum which took place in Scotland in September 1997, the vote being overwhelmingly yes. So today we have a new parliament which was convened in 1999. That's a devolved parliament, note. This is completely different from the independence referendum that came later and failed. This is a devolved parliament. So how old then, getting to my topic today, the institution of the Old Scottish Parliament. The earliest record of a parliament in Scotland is in the 1230s under King Alexander II, coinciding with when English assemblies first used the word parliament. Certainly the Old Scottish Parliament was very old by its last meeting in 1707. Both Scottish and English versions gathered after the first recorded parliament in Europe, the two Cortes of the Kingdoms of Leon and Castile in Spain in 1188. King Alfonso IX of Leon called them that year, at which nobles, clergy and men of the towns, the three estates, as we would call them, the brazos, as Spanish call them, were present to consult over matters of peace and war. And there's this idea, the medieval idea, of the stations of society, those who pray, those who fight, and those who toil. Those who pray, the clergy; those who fight, the nobles; those who toil, the merchants, the representative of the towns. What was the nature and evolution of the Parliament then? The pre-modern Parliament of Scotland was unicameral. It had one chamber. So also today's Scottish Parliament, unlike Washington and Westminster. Parliament met as the estates of this ancient kingdom, summoned by the Crown on 40 days' notice. There were 3 or 4 estates, and through the attendance of the estates, we can see the Scottish Parliament evolving. There were 2 main types of assembly: full parliaments and conventions of estates, the latter called on shorter notice and with limited powers, such as setting taxation that would later be ratified by a full parliament, or for emergencies, such as the Revolution of 1689. The clergy were almost always present, before and after the Scottish Reformation of 1560, though not under the Covenanters from 1639 to 1651, with their belief that the kingdom of God was separate to the kingdom of the earth. They were restored at the Restoration in 1661, but vanished from Parliament completely in 1689 after the Revolution against King James VII and II, of which one of my previous talks was about, of course. Always present were the nobles, as lords, as tenants-in-chief, although in the mid-15th century, when the Lords of Parliament were introduced, who were under special obligation to attend, lesser or small tenants, or lairds as we often call them, stopped attending, other than those who were officers of state. The original right of all tenants-in-chief to attend was simply forgotten, and the reforms of the 15th century were really there to clear out lesser lairds. Nonetheless, James I in the 1420s had proposed the lairds be accommodated by representative means. But it was only in 1587 that members for the shires were introduced to fill this gap, and that shire elections took place. The electorate was small, based on land assessment. Burgesses were the last estate, first appearing in the 14th century, but in and out before it becoming a regular feature by the end of the 15th. The borough members were representatives of royal boroughs and were elected by their respective town councils. In other words, you could be elected by 20 people or 30 people, whatever the number of town councils were. Borough attendance was seen, of course, as a practical means to legitimise taxation when much of the taxation fell on the towns anyway. As we enter the last busy decades of the Parliament after 1689, we revert back to 3 estates: nobles, shires and boroughs, plus the officers of state. Of those, the most common attendees being the Chancellor, the most senior, who presided over parliaments and privy councils, the Privy Seal, who authenticated the official documents, Lord Advocate, the Crown's main legal counsel and prosecutor, and the Clerk Register, the Chief Archivist and Clerk. Like with the clergy, there was considerable jealousy about the dangers of too much voting power by cronies of the Crown appointing bishops, Crown appointing office of state, and office of state were excluded completely from Parliament from 1640 to 51. How representative was Parliament then? Well, it's not democratic, obviously. But on the other hand, it was not entirely unrepresentative. Nobles and clergy attended by right of summons, and officers of state as Crown nominees. The borough and shire members were elected, as I've said, and there was competition for seats, as seen in the numerous election disputes which arose in the 17th century. Disputes arose over the status of candidates and the electors. And these disputes became a serious problem in the 1660s, and a committee was established for each parliament to investigate such matters, although governments before and after 1689 sometimes controlled the outcome, as you can well imagine. Does that happen today? I'll leave you to comment on that. However, perhaps more important is the basis in which the members of the Scottish Parliament represented the localities, shires, boroughs, regional earldoms, landed estates. The link with Parliament was always land, and even the boroughs were corporate tenants-in-chief. Nonetheless, as very few challenged the right of the landed interest to represent the country before 1707, land was in a, what you might call, best-worse situation in representing the interests of tenant farmers, craftsmen, fishermen, and the general populace. When a laird from the Shire of Fife sought to use Parliament to protect his interests in coal and salt, he indirectly represented the interests of his coal and salt workers. Nonetheless, this could be a small assembly. Attendance was variable. From 1603 to 1660, its attendance exceeded 150 on only 6 occasions and once rose to over 180. After the restoration of the monarchy, it only twice exceeded 190 until in its last few years, when it averaged 226, with an average of 67 nobles, 80 shires elected, and 67 constituent towns, and the remainder officers of state. In 1641, during wartime, only 29 attended. Wow. In a Scottish feature not found in England, by the 1690s, as many as 50 additional extraordinary attendees were invited to assist and advise, but never to vote. For example, as you can see in Table 18 in this structure, this diagram of how the Parliament was laid out. Judges from the Court of Session, the High Civil Court, sat in the chamber to offer advice but could not vote. Also, elections were infrequent. From 1689 to 1707, there were only 2 general elections, in 1689 and 1702. In both cases, when a new monarch was created. Just to emphasise the horseshoe shape of the chamber, completely unlike, let's say, the House of Commons or the House of Lords, where the opposition sit next to each other in the chamber. This is the horseshoe shape that the Scottish Parliament was arranged in. Where and when and how often did it meet? Well, from the medieval period, Parliament met in a variety of places: Perth, Stirling, and other royal centres. Parliament followed the king, in other words. And it was only in the reign of James II, following his father's murder at Perth in 1437, that the more secure Edinburgh became increasingly the home of Parliament. And when in Edinburgh, it mostly met at the Old Tolbooth, seen here, near St Giles, or in St Giles itself, though James VI was fond of gathering at Holyrood Palace as well, before he left for London in 1603. The completion of the Parliament House in 1639 at last gave the Assembly a permanent home. It is indeed the oldest surviving purpose-built parliamentary hall in the world. Parliament met most regularly, not after 1660, as we might think, but after 1689. If you take the period from 1660 to 1607, it met on average for 40 days every year, but not at all in some years, such as 1675 to 7 and 1687 to 8. And of course, the Parliament didn't meet at all from 1652 to 59 during the Cromwellian period. There were no meetings. It's quite. How did it work? Well, in Scotland, the king or queen attended Parliament, sitting on the throne and therefore sitting among the members, as does the monarch in the new Parliament since 1999, although, of course, only for the day of the state opening, after each election every 4 years. So, King Charles did this recently in the Scottish Parliament. In the old chamber, the monarch contributed to debate, and some, like James VI, wouldn't shut up. After 1603, a High Commissioner or Viceroy sat on the throne representing the Crown, with instructions on key legislation and power to give royal assent by touching the sceptre, not signing the acts like the monarch does today for the UK and Scottish Parliaments. Business was carried out in 3 ways: by the whole House, sometimes a committee of the whole House, by debate in estates, and by a committee with each of the estates represented. Committees existed in the 14th century, but developed a more complex character by the 17th. The Covenanters, in particular, from 1639 to 51, introduced various ad hoc groups. The committees, some of these were continued into the Restoration period, with standing committees for trade, elections, and security. However, after 1702, matters tended to be considered in plain or whole Parliament, as members were suspicious that the Crown was packing the committees with its own cronies. The most important committee in the House in the history of the Parliament was called the Lords of the Articles. Established by the 1460s and continuing until 1689, bar the years 1640 to 51, and consisting of members chosen of each of the estates. Now, the power of this committee is one of the controversies exercised as Scottish historians. There's no time to go into it here. However, it's true that the committee took over the preparation and scrutiny of legislation for much of the period of its existence. Parliament gathered to choose the Lords of the Articles, departing to the pubs of Edinburgh and returning at the end of a session to vote legislation through en bloc, perhaps in a single day. However, there was actually much to and fro between the Lords of the Articles and MPs. It was a large committee in the 17th century, around 40 strong, and so larger than some full parliaments held when it was suspended in the 1640s. Also, the Lords of the Articles had to answer to a full Parliament. And after 1660, periodical reporting rather than en bloc reporting allowed more opportunity for voting. The crux of the matter is, how much do you believe the Crown was able to control membership? That most members of the Lords of the Articles were also privy councillors appointed by the Crown tells us something. However, more recently, historians have emphasised how it was a parliament within a parliament, and sometimes rejected royal policy. Clearly, though, its abolition in 1689 made Crown control of parliamentary business more difficult and helped propel the House to increasing party politics before 1707. How did voting take place? Well, until the mid-17th century, as I've said, the scrutinising voting possibilities were a bit more limited. There was the choosing of the Lords of the Articles, though sometimes the nobles and the clergy chose the other estates. Voting the acts en bloc at the end of a session could make it impossible to vote on a single act. This could, however, put some pressure on the government where vital taxation legislation might fail if Parliament was unhappy with, say, a matter of conscience or religious faith. However, after 1689, voting was possible on a more regular basis and proceeded act by act. Voting was oral, not by secret ballot or lobby. The roll was simply read and members voted aye or nay, with the most senior voting first. The reverse of how the English House of Lords proceeded. This is interesting. So, the Prince of Wales now William is a member of the House of Lords. He could vote on something, but he's probably only likely to turn up and vote for two reasons. One, because it was so close, the vote, that his single vote mattered. Or two, the Crown was trying to make a point, or the government was trying to make a point. However, in the Scottish Parliament, it was the other way around. The most senior voted first. So the most senior noble in the Parliament in the 17th century, the Duke of Hamilton, voted first, even though he became an opposition leader. The most senior bishop, the Archbishop of St Andrews, voted first in the clergy. Edinburgh voted first as the most senior borough. So you get the idea now how it operated. Now you might say, does voting first mean that you control the voting of people who come after you? You expect them to follow you. Well, the case of Hamilton blows that argument wide open. Doesn't have to apply. What about ritual? Ritual was a vital part of the culture of parliaments and assemblies. We know only little of the internal rituals in Scotland. For example, we don't know if the House followed similar practices to Westminster, where in the 17th century members sat with hats on and removed them to address the House. Nonetheless, the most dramatic ritual was the riding of Parliament, which occurred at the start and end of each Parliament, though not each session. Thus, although there were 10 sessions under King William, in a single Parliament stretching from 1689 to 1702, there were not 10 ridings. Indeed, Parliament was prorogued in 1707, no doubt because a last riding would have been a focus for popular protest and riot by anti-unionism throughout Edinburgh. In 1606, James VI and his Privy Council regulated for the riding, which set out from Holyrood Palace to the Tolbooth, up the Royal Mile, or later, not to the Tolbooth, but to the new Parliament House. Borough members 2 by 2 on foot, shire members 2 by 2 on horseback, followed by nobles and clergy on horse, in the order marquesses and dukes, archbishops, earls, bishops and lords, the latest in creation to march foremost. Then the honours, the crown, the sceptre and the sword, without which no parliament could be valid, followed by the High Commissioner, the Viceroy. Restrictions were placed on retinue, 24 for earls, 12 for lords, etc., etc., all moved by procession to the Parliament close by St Giles, dismounted from the horses, and then walked to the Parliament House, creating a scene of equine chaos in the narrow streets, one suspects. One can easily imagine. So, what did Parliament do? Parliament was sometimes something of a universal set in the affairs of Scotland. It may be what we would expect today, but it was also true before 1707. It considered a variety of themes and legislated accordingly. Let's just quickly look at a few. It had a judicial function. Parliament was, above all, a court, the highest court of the land. And there were certain judicial functions only it had power over, which distinguished it from councils or conventions, or indeed the other criminal and civil courts in Scotland. Treason and forfeiture cases, for example. And there was this power it had called the falsing of dooms, that is, appeals from lower courts. It was relatively unusual for lower courts to appeal to Parliament, but it could. I think you could imagine the kind of person who would appeal from a lower court would be a member of Parliament himself, who felt that he could speak his case more. He could find a sympathetic audience, shall I say, among other members of Parliament. Though, of course, in the 16th century, the Court of Session handled most of the civil cases. And also, Parliament could do what it wanted. It had the power to interfere in anything it wished. Taxation. Before the reign of James VI, the monarch was expected to live off their own means, that is, income from crown lands, customs, fines and forfeitures, and so on. And while early taxations were granted for this and that, Parliament also blocked efforts to raise extraordinary taxes by, for example, James I and James III in the 15th century. However, the tax regime became more complex in the 17th century with, in 1621, the introduction of a regular land tax, which developed the character of an income tax. Excise duties were introduced in the 1640s. The introduction of a monthly cess or tax on assessments of valued rent in 1667. A poll tax from 1593 and a hearth tax in 1691 per household, although that was quickly abandoned. Convention of Estates were called in 1665, 67 and 78 purely for the purpose of raising revenue, for no other reason. But economic policy was not just about taxation. It was action over coinage, adjusting interest rates, passing legislation to ban imports and exports, setting rates of customs and excise, licensing manufacturers and patent, setting up committees to consider measures to advance trade, all took place. And parliaments and kings governed people, of course, and so they became involved in the social fabric, and before 1707 to a degree in a sort of nanny knows best manner, perhaps. Although it was always very different other and in criminal cases to enforce much, even though the church tried. Education at school and university, morality private and public, policies over the poor and idle, and legislation that protected children and minors, inherited wealth, rights of way, and supporting town authorities in a variety of initiatives to rebuild urban areas, harbours and bridges after war, fire and flood. These were all added to the mix. Meanwhile, foreign policy was more at the behest of the king, although Parliament from time to time asserted its right to sanction war. The Regal Union of 1603 distanced Scotland from foreign policy even more, but inasmuch as it concerned trade, it continued to be active. Also, communications with the Crown and Westminster had to be maintained. Internal security, like the suppression, arrest and punishment of religious and political dissenters, and maintaining a small army and the fabric of castles and prisons, remained a key policy for Parliament and the government. Religious policy was one of the cornerstones of parliamentary business and usually the first act to pass in every session. Not simply every parliament, but every session, the acts were restated over and over again about the role of the Crown in protecting the church. Legislation confirmed the distribution of church lands, salaries for clergy, and according to the government of the day, the stated degree of royal authority over the government of the church. In the main, Parliament reflected Crown policy, although it was also petitioned by the clergy, especially the Presbyterian General Assembly, when it met, to legislate over issues such as incest, witchcraft, blasphemy, and immorality in general. Some issues such as education were areas where Parliament and the Church intersected and their interests converged. It should also not be forgotten that the legislation and evolution of the mechanisms of Parliament, of course, occurred in a political context. Factionalism has been ever present in Scottish politics. Before we enter the Parliamentary Union of 1707, we see the advent of party politics. Although it had begun to emerge in the 1660s, and some historians argue even earlier. Pre-Union politics was not, though, party politics as we know it today. Democrats, Republicans, Conservatives and Labour, left and right, but more a case of locating politics by map reference, as seen here, where you can be a country Tory or a country Whig, a court Tory, a court Whig. So, you place it's a bit like politics by dartboard, if you like. You place where you are and you're still a member of a party, but it depends whether you're in government or not. That's pretty much how it looks. A comparison between the dealings of different monarchs with Parliament is instructive and provides a sense of the relationship between Crown and the Estates. So I think we'll have a quick look at the Magnificent Seven, as I call them. Beginning with Mary Queen of Scots, she held 3 parliaments and 2 conventions during her brief reign. The most controversial parliament was held in her absence in 1560, when the Reformation was enacted. Her parliaments did relatively little, and so there were no major controversies. The parliaments of her son James VI were immediately more dramatic. That of late 1567 ratified the Protestant Church Acts, not ratified by Mary. However, the Church may not have been in apparent control, given its failure to have wide-sweeping acts to better finance itself, or get Parliament ratification for the Book of Discipline, which it recommended as a manual of worship. It shows that the nobles were completely back in charge during James's minority and the regency of the Earl of Morton. James, when he took control himself, enjoyed calling parliaments and conventions and did so regularly. I think he liked the audience to listen to his opinions. The Black Acts, Presbyterianism sidelined, and the Golden Acts, Presbyterianism put on a legal basis, came and went. But we see the first phase through which a gradual implementation of taxation is added to the mix. Also, James encouraged the introduction of elected shire members, really a way to keep out the riffraff. In his Scottish reign from 1580 to 1603, a parliament or a convention were convened at least once every year. And James, especially after 1596, showed himself experienced at managing parliament and the agenda. After 1603, James used his skill working through his commissioner and had developed to new levels his control of the Lords of the Articles. However, differences of opinion within the Articles can be seen in parliaments of 1606, 9, 12 and 21. And even in the Parliament of 1617, with James present, he said he would come back every few years. He only did once. The Estates questioned the numbers of officers of state who could vote in Parliament and insisted it was limited to 8, however many attended. And the high point of his coercion for James was the Parliament of 1621. When the Estates were pressed to pass an act confirming what were called the 5 Articles of Perth, a set of measures to impose Church of England rituals on the Church of Scotland. But even they passed by a majority only, with 42% abstaining or voting against. Charles I now made the mistake of not holding, as tradition dictated, a new parliament as soon as he succeeded his father. His good intentions were more easily doubted without this. Before the revolution against him, 2 conventions were held to raise taxes, and a parliament planned for 1628 was delayed to 33 when he came to Scotland for his Scottish coronation. When it met, the key issue, which might strike you as remarkable, was church policy and the dress of clergy. Not a major concern, you might think, but he handled it aggressively. First of all, he included within the Act a clause confirming the royal prerogative so that a refusal to vote for clerical attire could leave MPs accused of treason. And secondly, he sat down like a demented head prefect and noted down the name of all those who voted against him. Nonetheless, there was still opposition. In the Covenanting period, of course, Parliament behaved with greater independence, in the name of the king, but not with his blessing. 3 very long parliaments from 39 to 41, 44 to 7, and 48 to 51 happened. These were dominated by the Covenanting nobility, though the last of these saw the eclipse of some after the failed engagement, a vain attempt by force to restore Charles I before his execution. This appeared where the very structure of Parliament changed. Out went the church, out went the Lords of the Articles. In came a series of complex committees, some session committees and interval committees that met between parliaments to handle specific areas. When monarchy was restored for Charles II in 1660, he had the memory of the parliament he attended in Scotland in 1651, that odd meeting where he was crowned at Scone as Cromwell's forces occupied much of Scotland. After an uncertain start made easier by a very loyal Parliament, the work of his High Commissioners at the Earls Middleton and Lauderdale delivered the royal agenda in terms of religious and fiscal policy, but also created a drift towards party politics. the monopoly of patronage, and resentments at those out of power created tensions. Also, the Parliament had not returned to the arbitrary ways of 1633, and issues were debated one by one. Taxation was agreed to for limited periods, so that Parliament had to be convened more frequently. All the same, it still met irregularly and not at all in some years. So, conversely, we could argue Charles's skill at sometimes getting several years of tax agreed, reducing the need to call a Parliament at all. The frequency of their meetings, I think, in this this data here is of interest, is a background to this section of my talk. There was then some continuing government control of the Parliament in 1681, when James, as Duke of Albany, his brother's High Commissioner, and in the other sessions of 1685 and 6, when James was king and represented by others. James was obsessed with details of Parliament, and his commissioners received numerous interactions and revised instructions. He was a control freak. However, James ultimately failed to get the prize of Catholic toleration voted by Parliament. And we see that the Lords of the Articles had developed a stronger independent streak from the 1670s onwards and in the reign of James VII. After the Revolution, King William was somewhat bemused at the Scottish Parliament, unable to comprehend its workings. He never visited Scotland, of course. However, he had no choice but to make concessions to those who welcomed the Revolution. Patronage became under even greater strain, without the Lords of the Articles, which as a grievance was promptly abolished. In addition, a new generation of parliamentarians was present with an eye to reforming procedures and creating an atmosphere of accountability. Both party, politics and faction were rife. The difficulty was that ministers were often too vulnerable to get much done. There were no Lauderdales in the Parliament now. Issues such as conceding the formation of a trading company, the Company of Scotland, to defuse the scandal of the Glencoe massacre of 1692, when 38 MacDonalds were killed by a government force for being too slow to take an oath to William, show how politics could now blow up without religion being a factor. Lastly, Queen Anne, more than any other monarch since 1560, depended on ministers to get things done. Big picture to do with war in Europe and eventually the Anglo-Scottish Union dominated her approach. And she left the Scottish Parliament to deal with many other issues. Nonetheless, the disputes over the succession, 1700, saw the death at the age of 11 of Anne's last and oldest surviving child. She had had 18 pregnancies, 5 had lived to infancy, all had died, a remarkable reversal for the 350-year royal line of Stuarts. And also disputes over declarations of war revealed that the Parliament had become very difficult to manage. We are left to marvel at the successful steering of the Act of Parliamentary Union through a hothouse of the Scottish Parliament. These issues then show that the Scottish Parliament reflected and forged the history of Scotland during the 16th and 17th centuries. It was not weak or a poodle, as some English historians claim, as they compare it to Westminster, the so-called mother of parliaments. Our mother's just as old as their mother is. It mattered, and Scots knew it. Now, I'm now going to turn to the sort of second part of my talk, which is new research. And it's amazing how, again, research, as I say, is a bit like, as I said at the start, it's a bit like figuring out a career path. How did I end up, having this job when 10 years ago I was doing something completely different? Well, this is my newest piece of research, and it came about by chance. How did the Scottish Parliament sound? Sometimes we come to a research topic by chance then. Last year, my wife and I had toured the cities between Bucharest and Prague. In the process, we visited Omoluk in the Czech Republic and took the short journey to view the Bishop's Palace of Kromenitz, seen here. This is a remarkable structure, museum and art gallery. But more significantly is where the Austrian Reichstag, or Imperial Diet, met in 1849, having decamped from Vienna during the political crisis and hostilities of the Vienna Uprising and the widespread mid-century European revolutions that occurred in virtually every other European country apart from the British Isles. This Diet was first elected. This Diet was the first elected parliament in the Austrian Empire, and although its constitutional basis was quickly nullified, it has an important place in Austrian constitutional history. The 296 deputies met in this great palace ballroom, built in the 1770s after a fire in 1752 by Maximilian Hamilton, Prince Bishop of Olomouc, within the Holy Roman Empire. Excuse my mugshot here. It's the only picture I have of this painting. I do apologise. A life-size portrait of Maximilian is hung on the wall of the ballroom. In fact, he was the great-great-grandson of James Hamilton, 1st Earl of Abercorn, an administrator and courtier in the reign of James VI and 1st. He was a Protestant himself, but his father was Claude Hamilton, Lord Paisley, who sided with Mary, Queen of Scots, and foreshadowed the Catholic side of the Hamilton family, many of whom went into exile. Abercorn's own sons, on his death, were raised as Catholics. And the Hamiltons were one of the greatest political families in Scotland and split into two camps. I mean, he is still the major Scottish noble. You may not know this, but at the state opening of the new Scottish Parliament, the crown is taken into the chamber by the Duke of Hamilton. He's the most senior noble in Scotland. At one time, with the death of Queen Anne, there's even a suggestion that he could make a claim for the throne. It was possible, but he'd have to got through a few others, but nonetheless. The ballroom was huge. Dare I say it, even Donald Trump might be jealous. The floor is 4,500 square feet in size, and the hall is 52 feet high. It also contains, as you see on the right here, a model of how the 1849 assembly was arranged. And it occurred to me that such a cliff edge of steep benches and high ceilings would have an impact on acoustics. The Parliament Hall in Edinburgh is also a large structure. Completed in the 1630s, the first sitting occurred there in 1639. At a time when revolution was in the air, as Edinburgh and the political elites of Scotland rejected King Charles I's policies. Before then, Charles badgered the magistrates of Edinburgh to build the hall, in part to stop the secular use of parts of St Giles Cathedral nearby, in his efforts to elevate the religious grandeur of the church, for which he also created the bishopric of Edinburgh. He also had them pay to build 2 additional parish churches to remove the masses from the high church. No pun intended by that. However, the existing available accommodation for meetings was not adequate, as it had met in parts of St Giles or in the new Talbot building that sat next to and west of the church. One issue, therefore, was that the number of elected and non-elected attendees sitting in the Parliament had increased, along with administrative officers and individuals who had to attend as well. So building began in 1632 and was only completed in 1640, a little after the first Parliament met there. What we see today, the original roof and dimensions, are as they were in 1640. A just over 5,000 square feet floor area and a ceiling 36 feet high. However, a wooden dais was built at the south end. This picture here is from the north, and the north end had a screen and for a period a small balcony. In this space from the 1660 to 1707, attendance rose slowly from about 190 to 225 members. What would the acoustic properties be for such a structure? The building, remarkably, survived the nearby Edinburgh fire of 1700 and the Great Fire of 1824, as painted by the great artist Turner in this image here. And this shows that St Giles on the left survived, as well as the Parliament to the right. perhaps that is the remarkable thing. Maybe we owe it to the early Fire Brigade of Edinburgh that they managed to keep these buildings safe. It also occurred to me we should be able to make comparisons with the chambers of the British House of Commons and House of Lords in an acoustic sense before microphones were introduced in 1950 and 1975 respectively. Both were originally situated in religious chapels at Westminster. The Commons was located in St Stephen's Chapel from 1547 to 1834, a space measuring 2,000 square feet only. It was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1834. A new chamber was built between 1837 and 60, restored in 1950 after bomb damage in World War II, which is now 3,000 square feet, just over in size, and just over 29 feet high. Wooden benches predominate, which take up about 80% of the space, and there is a large timber balcony as well. Attendance in the late 17th century was just over 500 when all attended. Today, typical occupancy is now 650, although many have to stand. The House of Lords, until 1801, was located in the Painted Chamber of Westminster, essentially a narrow lobby, originally used by the monarch for his devotions, or her devotions, before moving to the White Chamber or Lesser Hall until the Great Fire of 1834. What we now have is the neo-Gothic chamber we see today, built as well from 1837 to 60. It is much larger than the Commons, the floor measuring 4,500 square feet, and in height it is 49 feet high. The full attendance for around the year 1700 was on average only 70 to 100, with the maximum being 190. Now it has a theoretical membership of 774 and is the only second chamber in the world to be numerically greater than its first chamber. Huge expansions have taken place in the modern period, especially of life peers. The last hereditary peers were removed in April this year. Typically, attendance today averaged just over 400. So, how do we compare these four sessions? Excuse me. This has been made possible by me taking advice from my son Robert, who happens to be a sound engineer. Now, those of you who are parents are always anxious to get a return on your investment, and this provides a rare opportunity for me to get such a return. It is clear that a precise analysis of acoustics is impossible, as there are too many unknown factors when considering historical periods. However, it is possible to have a theoretical modelling approach to give us some idea. Working with the norm that mid-frequencies, say 500 to 1,000 hertz, are those most relevant for speech, that there is no amplification, that building materials and furniture are taken on a best guess basis for the time, that attendance figures are taken from documented data, and that occupancy is a factor in acoustic absorption, we can do comparative work. Well, finally, we need an analytical tool to bring this all together. In 1890, an American Harvard physicist called Wallace Sabine was asked to quantify why a particular meeting hall had poor acoustics. And in doing this, he invented the Sabine equation. This calculates reverberation time, the time required for sound energy to decay by 60 decibels after the source ceases. Equation is above at the top of the screen. Where V is room volume in meters cubed, I apologize for this, but meters are used for this particular calculation. Room volume in meters cubed. A is total equivalent absorption area, the surface area of the room absorbing sound in meters squared Cb. What we've done is take typical modern mid-frequency absorption values for current architectural acoustics and made assumptions about pre-industrial levels for a range of elements calculated in percentages of the whole internal structure. Stonemasonry, timber panelling, plasterwork, timber flooring, carpets, upholstered seating, attire, and attendance levels, we calculate that pre-modern halls had roughly 20 to 30% less sound absorption compared with modern 20th and 21st century structures. For example, older structures without cavity walls. Acoustic energy is often reflected more and absorbed less in pre-modern structures. Also, textiles differ in furnishings, with a lack of soundproofing, fibres and carpets, which need to be balanced against natural fibres worn by pre-modern attendees that absorb more sound than lighter synthetics used in modern garments. Lastly, in pre-modern speech making without amplification, more is required of vocal projection, advantageous location within the chamber, and enforced silence. These are not in themselves measurable, but they will alter how reverberation and clarity interact and the experience of those who are listening. Let's consider these halls one by one. I hope you're all bearing with me. I think this is groundbreaking research in terms of history, but no doubt somebody will trip me up one day. The Bishop's Palace, first of all. The long reverberation time, 2.8 seconds, which you can see in this table, suggests a deep, resonant, and immersive acoustic environment. Speech would likely have required the grand address, and some emotional weight, though at the expense of rapid verbal detail. In such a space, speakers likely adjusted by speaking more slowly, projecting their voices, and adopting a more formal style. For listeners, the experience may have been less about close analysis and more about shared attentive listening, perhaps in 1849 reinforcing the historic importance of the assembly meeting during this revolutionary period. Parliament Hall, Edinburgh. Based on the calculated reverberation time of 3.1 seconds, it is reasonable to assume that Parliament Hall exhibited moderately long reverberant sounds, producing a sense of resonance without an extreme echo. It has to be remembered that echo is a different sound, so we're not looking at echo here. Speech within the hall would likely have benefited from early sound reflections from timber and stone surfaces, contributing to vocal presence, while sustained decay would have blended successive sounds, meaning that the sound would continue for a period of time. This acoustic environment likely encouraged slower speech, closer listening, and more formalised ways of speaking. Rather than supporting rapid debate, the hall's acoustics may have reinforced a sense of gravity and perhaps formal behaviour. The House of Commons. The relatively short calculated reverberation time, 0.75 seconds, suggests a dry, clarity-orientated acoustic environment. In the absence of amplification, this condition would have offered limited acoustic support to speakers. In order to be heard, they had to project the voices because there wasn't this reverberant thing that took the voices out. And for listeners, particularly those not positioned advantageously from the source, this could be a problem. Amplification from 1950 would help with this, of course, although it came after the likes of Winston Churchill made his famous speeches. Speech intelligibility may have been high for nearby listeners, but would depend strongly on vocal strength and audience silence. The space can therefore be assumed to have been vocally demanding, giving advantage to confident or trained speakers and potentially contributing to fatigue by the people speaking, and who knows, by those who are listening as well. From an acoustic perspective, the chamber likely encouraged direct and immediate exchange as the party leaders faced each other. The oppositional chamber style will have helped with that, I think. And lastly, the House of Lords. The calculated reverberation time, 1.7 seconds, places the House of Lords between clarity-driven and reverberant extremes. These conditions likely supported calm, measured speaking, allowing voices to carry with some warmth while remaining easy to understand. Such acoustics may perhaps have enhanced the dignity of proceedings, giving emphasis to pauses and formal speech. The space can therefore be seen as acoustically supporting its role as a place for review and deliberation as well. Generally, pre-amplification of our four chambers, this was the best. So, what can we say about the Scottish Parliament in these contexts? Well, as often, it is what we don't know that makes this analysis tantalising. The acoustics of the chamber leave us to wonder the extent to which conduct and behaviour were moderated as a result of the acoustic environment. For example, if the acoustics suggest slower speech was needed, with closer listening and formalised speech making without interruptions, then were speeches policed in particular ways? We don't know. To what extent did officers, in this case the Chancellor, involve themselves in disciplining speakers and listeners to ensure fair hearing and debate? We don't really know, in spite of diaries and commentary by contemporaries. Was a running order agreed before speeches were made on the day? We don't know. It seems sensible, but we don't know. Was silence by listeners seen as a priority when interruptions would make both broadcasting and reception problematic? Was this a traditional approach due to social and political convention, or was it a response to the acoustics of the chamber? We don't know. Were all speeches delivered from an advantageous position in the chamber? In general, we don't know, although major ones certainly will. And how were great speeches in Parliament, in the old Scottish Parliament, have been received? John Hamilton, 2nd Lord Belhaven, delivered a famous speech before the Scottish Parliament on the 2nd of November 1706. He was a staunch opponent of Anglo-Scottish parliamentary union and produced one of the most famous episodes of oratory in the Parliament's history. It began, "I think I see a free and independent kingdom delivering up that which all the world hath been fighting for since the days of Nimrod, yea, that for which most of all the empires, kingdoms, states, principalities, and dukedoms of Europe are at this time engaged in the most bloody, cruel wars that ever were, to wit, a power to manage their own affairs by themselves without the assistance and counsel of any other." He continues, "I think I see our ancient mother Caledonia, like Caesar, sitting in the midst of our Senate, ruefully looking round about her, covering herself with her royal garment, attending the fatal blow, and breathing out her last with an etu queque mi fili." Opponents mocked Belhaven's sincerity, but the speech was printed and circulated widely. That suggests to me a Parliament that, even as it faced its adjournment in May 1707, was engaged with throughout Scottish society. When the then Chancellor James Ogilvy, Earl of Seafield, mused at the signing as he signed the Act of Union, "Now there's an end on auld sang," he recognised a long history of parliamentary development and evolution, of an institution that was the cornerstone of Scotland's national history for 500 years. Thank you very much.
Oh, fantastic, Alastair. Thank you very much. That was terrific. Speaking of acoustics, I just stepped into a supermarket, so I apologise for the overhead paging. I'd never really thought about how the acoustics could inform how debates.
I can't hear you very well. You're breaking up.
He's gone into his own.
A supermarket. So.
Well, you're right. I was terrified that Connie never told me much about you all, and it terrified me that one of you was an architect or somebody who's wise and would trip me up straight away. I have to say, tell you, this is the first time I've done that. I'm going to a parliamentary conference in Barcelona in 3 weeks' time, and that's when I will really find out if anybody's done this before me. But anyway,
it was fascinating to really think, Alastair, about how acoustics can impact and inform debate. I'd never really thought about that before, so thank you for kind of opening my ears. Pardon the pun.
That's all right. I hope it didn't terrify the people in the supermarket who are worried about strange kind of pictures of Czech palaces and so on. But anyway, never mind.
Hi, it's Stacy. I do have a question
Yeah,
about
please.
the policies that the Parliament oversees on that page, and you mentioned it briefly about religion, and that they oversaw things like immorality and wow, um, things that you wouldn't think today would be part of Parliament's responsibilities. And also So what I'm looking for is some more feedback on that, mainly because what brings that to mind, as you know, the US is celebrating its 250, and there are numerous opportunities on the streaming media to renew and refresh our memory on what the US is based on, what our founding fathers did not want to have. They did not want to have a parliament. They wanted to have, something that was brand spanking new we had never done before. So with that in mind, what is your reflection on the purpose of the parliament and what the Scottish immigrants to the US, including us ourselves, um, chose to do differently, and why?
Um, well, petitions is something that, but I think there's two kind of sort of psychological things here. One is a view about monarchy, which is slightly different in Scotland. Uh, uh, the king was viewed as the first among equals in Scotland, if you like. He was called James was called my lord, and then went to London. All of a sudden, he's your majesty. That was a change. Okay, so there's different English and Scottish views about that, but that doesn't. Oddly, that's possibly makes Scots more patriotic than the English in this in that sort of in that way, because you you defend a neighbour more than you defend your superior, if you know what I mean. There's a kind of different approach to it. The other thing I would point to is the strength of Presbyterianism, which is a kind of ground up religion. It's not a sort of it's from the bottom up rather than the top down in its approach. And although the Presbyterians didn't believe that clergy should be in Parliament. So any time the Presbyterians were on the up and bishops were out, the clergy left Parliament. And so, but what happened was there are other means in which you could get things done. For example, you had lay elders who were quite often members of Parliament who attended presbyteries. Okay, so they were participating in religion. You still had this old mechanism where the commissioner, a royal commissioner representing the crown, would take the chair of General Assembly meetings. That still happens, by the way. The Queen used to do it. The King does. It's usually it'll be Prince William next time. It was Prince Charles before he was king quite often. Some of that was because the Queen was getting old, but also because she was sharing around responsibilities. So there's a kind of each Presbyterian minister has a single vote when things happen, right? In other words, you could be the Presbyterian minister at St Giles, or you could be the Presbyterian minister at the church down the road in Dunblane, where I live, and you'd still have only one vote. Now, of course, you would earn more money and more prestige if you worked at St Giles. So there's a kind of, Scots are apt to exaggerate how wonderful they are in terms of the, social policy and social attitudes and all the rest of it. In fact, there's quite a lot of compromise going on still in every country in the world when it comes to stuff. Okay, so but certainly there's that. So how does that affect the Parliament? Well, I think because they're all in the same room, there are risks to everybody being in the same room in terms of what's maybe people are going to kowtow to the most senior people in the room. But on the other hand, it means everybody a witness. Everybody sees what happens. And that's important. And that fits in with another Presbyterian idea that you should always get married in public, where there are witnesses, and not do it in a private ceremony. So there's a kind of, and I know that there were a couple of clergy who were involved in signing your Declaration of Independence and everything like that. So that there's elements of all this. This is a very complicated answer, but I think that the Parliament, I would say it's less the Parliament, more the parliamentarians that matter in this regard.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So you're saying the clergy were or were not members of Parliament in Scotland, and they did or did not have a vote?
No, it depended. When bishops existed, like the Reformation came along, and what happened? There's a kind of 10-year hiatus, but bishops become re-established, and they're sitting in Parliament. So you've got 12, 13 of them who can sit in Parliament and vote, and then they get kicked out in 1639. The Covenanters, who are, you could say, extreme Presbyterians. That's a judgment call, but
Sure.
they kicked them out and said you're not supposed to be there. Having said that, they still expected the Parliament to be the civil magistrate, to still do what needed to be done. So, in other words, they would constantly appeal that action was taken, anything from witchcraft to immorality to use of the correct biblical texts, and
Right.
the
Wow.
prayer books, and all the rest of it. Although
Sure.
the Church of Scotland didn't like being told by the monarch what to do. And then so there's this thing about who's head of the church. Is it the king or is it God? And you get into this confusion sort of malaise of stuff in the 16th century. So Scotland we emerge in the 18th century with political strife over, but factionalism. I remember I once showed some students of mine a chart of divisions in the Church of Scotland. It's from 1700 to 1900, right? Actually, maybe 1920. But anyway. And honestly, it looks like the most complicated sort of central heating system you've ever seen in your life. Branches and things flying off in all directions,
Wow.
split over minor details, and then re-emerging and merging and
Wow.
But that's congregationalism's a bit like that, isn't it? It's about independence, about saying, well, we'll do what we want. And if doing what you want means, well, we don't quite like the chaps next door, we'll do what they're doing. Then you've still got the ability to re-emerge and do what you want again.
Great.
That's kind of how it is. So we had our when the Union happened in 1707. Those who opposed union thought that the risk to the Church of Scotland would lead to a no vote, because the clergy was terrified that they would be turned into an Anglican church with bishops again. Because to many Presbyterians, the Church of England is really Catholic. Because it's all, if you go to the High Church of England, there's incense burning and, all this kind of fandango, which would be, heresy to staunch Presbyterian who likes basic walls and no images and that kind of thing, So they thought that would be the problem. And what they had to do was to pass an act defending the Church of Scotland to get the Act of Union through. And they had to do that first, okay? And they did it by saying, now this is the astonishing thing, that it was the monarch's duty to defend the church. So the Parliament is sidestepped. The Westminster Parliament didn't have the authority with the Act of Union. The monarch had to defend it. Or leave it alone. That's the subtext, right? So that's it. So I don't know. I think it's difficult to say, isn't it? We're still messing with it in the British Isles. There are still unionists and anti-unionists. Well, the independence movement. The referendum for independence failed by a couple of percent, and we still reckon we're. Polls would tell you that there's a slight majority in favour of independence right now, in part because Scots are utterly fed up with government in London that keeps changing prime ministers all the time.
Yeah.
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that response.
Okay.
It's all background and foundation to who we are as Scottish people in the U.S. Yeah,
yeah,
thank you for that.
That's all right.
And
That's all right.
Alastair, there was one clergy member who signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was a Presbyterian from Scotland.
Witherspoon.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. Yes. Well, I said a couple. I was probably throwing in a couple of lay elders as well. But anyway, there are a
Yeah.
few Scots, there are a few kind of exiled Scots who signed it, and he was he was one. He's an important one to mention, though. You're absolutely right.
Well, and of
I'm
course,
getting a Doug Dugan entered the waiting room, wants to be admitted. Do I let him in? Or what does that mean? Do I do that?
You can do that.
All right. Okay.
and of course, Alexander Hamilton was, of course, Scottish, even though he didn't come from Scotland. But such a great history.
Yeah. I'm. My father's English. Let's get my dirty linen out in public. My father's English, and as you heard, I worked in London for 12 years in publishing, and my mother used to say, Alastair, every time I speak to you on the phone, you sound more English, and I had to say, well, look, Mum, people have to understand me on the phone, you know. So it was one of those things. So however, since coming back to Scotland, I've reclaimed my accent, I hope, at least to an extent.
There you
Although
go.
some people still think I come from some weird part of Fife, which is a bit worrying. But I'm originally from Aberdeen, by the way. That's where I'm from. But and as is my wife Leslie. So we are you know old cousins in quotes. But
Any other questions for Alastair?
yeah. So Connie didn't emerge.
She didn't. I've been texting her in the background there, and she was unable. Despite
I'm so sorry. I spoke to her last week. We did a test to make sure that I could get the Zoom working, and we had a long chat. She's having a difficult time just now, so yeah, I empathize that. But anyway, I'm so sorry. I hope you did record it so that people can hear it.
Yeah. We'll send it on to all the regulars.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And well, I mean, I'm now tasked with engaging with 5 grandchildren this evening, so I might have a stiff drink before I have to do that. But
good luck to you.
Yes, we love the little darlings, and well, this is it. I mean, having a son who's a sound engineer. I mean, for goodness sake, you know, all of a sudden. However, if I ever publish this, I'll have to put his name on it. He'll have to get, because he's done a lot of the number crunching for me. So if it doesn't work, I'll blame him.
There you go. I appreciated that return on investment you spoke about.
Yeah, well, indeed. But I'd love to do another one sometime. I mean, obviously in the future. Yeah. But it's just hearing you talk about Burns, because I'm a literary historian as well, so I get involved in that. And that was my original passion. And I got involved in political history just, I don't know, it just happens, doesn't it? And yeah, what can I say?
There's a lot of interest in Scotland's literary history, so I think we would find a lot of interested ears.
We'll work through the gateway of Connie. She can sniff out any bullshit that comes her way, no doubt, and avoid it.
Well, I thank you, Alastair, and thank everybody.
Thank you. I'm sorry it's been such a small audience. I thought you would be at your HQ today, and but anyway, there we go. It's been a pleasure.
But there must have been some issue with Connie unable to, and Dawn was unable to join, and we're missing lots of regulars. So I don't know what the issue was, but for those of us who made it through, thank you, and we'll see you next month for Sir John McEwen, who's going to be presenting on whether Berwick should be Scottish.
Oh wow! Well, that's a good one. That's a good one. Well, I'm my actual title is honorary senior research fellow at the moment, because they still want the value of my research, even though they don't want me being a nuisance, But one of the things that I've been asked to do is to get involved in various bits of teaching for the renewal. So I would be these poor students will be seeing my bald head coming into view again after all. So that should be fun for them. But I may introduce them to sonic history. We'll see how that
There you
goes.
go.
Okay. All right, guys.
Thank
Lovely to
you.
see
Thank you.
you.
Enjoy your
Bye
weekend.
now.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye bye.